My husband's son stood in the doorway of the funeral home and told me to leave. He said this wasn't my family. He said the arrangements were being handled by real relatives now, and that it would be better for everyone if I just went home and let them grieve in peace. I looked him straight in the eye, and I asked him one single question. His face went the color of a bedsheet. 24 hours later, I walked back into that funeral home wearing my full army dress uniform, 7 rows of ribbons across my chest, my beret tucked under my arm, and by the time I reached the front pew, half the room had gone silent and the other half was crying. My name is Eleanor Hale. Everyone who matters calls me Nora. I am 73 years old, and I served 31 years in the United States Army. This is the story of how my husband's own children tried to erase me from his funeral, and how I made sure that by the end of that day, they were the ones who wished they could disappear. Before I tell you what happened, I want to know something. Where are you watching this from tonight? Put your city in the comments. I read every single one of them. It means more to me than you know at my age to know someone out there is listening. Now let me take you back. Not 30 years, not even 1 year, just 11 days. 11 days ago, my husband Walter was alive. He was 76, stubborn as a mule, still climbing onto the tractor every morning even though his doctor and I both told him to stop. We had been married for 19 years. The second marriage for both of us. The kind of marriage where you already know exactly who you are before you find each other. So there's no wasted time pretending. Walter ran cattle on 400 acres outside a small town called Meadow Creek, Montana, land his own father had cleared with a mule team back in the 1950s. I met him at a veterans fundraiser 11 years after I retired from the Army, and within a year, I had sold my condo in Colorado Springs and moved into his farmhouse. And within 2 years, we were married at the little white church on Route 9 with maybe 30 people in the pews. Walter had 2 children from his first marriage, a marriage that ended when his first wife left him and the kids for a man she met at a conference in Denver. Craig was the older one, 48 years old now, a man who had spent most of his adult life convinced the world owed him something for the childhood he felt he'd been shortchanged. Denise was the younger one, 44, softer than her brother but never quite able to stand up to him. I had tried, for 19 years, to be a good stepmother to 2 grown adults who never wanted one. I sent birthday cards. I remembered their kids' names. I never once asked Walter to leave them out of his will. Never once asked for anything that wasn't mine to begin with. I just wanted to be tolerated. Most years, I got exactly that. Tolerated. 11 days ago, on a Tuesday morning, Walter had a heart attack while feeding the cattle. I found him face down near the water trough, and I did CPR until the paramedics arrived. And I rode in the ambulance holding his hand the entire way to Bozeman. And he never opened his eyes again. He was pronounced dead at 11:47 that morning. I want you to understand something about grief before I go any further into this story. Grief does not wait politely for you to handle your business. Grief walks into the room while you're still in your barn boots, and it sits down across from you, and it does not leave. It follows you into the shower, into the grocery store, into the quiet minute before sleep when you reach across the bed out of habit and remember, all over again, that there's nothing there. I did not have the luxury of falling apart, because within 6 hours of my husband's death, my stepson was already calling the funeral home. That first evening, Craig came to the farmhouse. He hugged me at the door, which surprised me, and for one small moment I thought maybe grief had softened something in him, the way it sometimes does. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table Walter and I had eaten breakfast at every single morning for 19 years. And Craig said all the right things. Dad wouldn't have wanted a big fuss. Dad would have wanted it simple. Dad always said he wanted to be buried next to his own parents at the county cemetery, not the veterans section, even though Walter himself never served. He used to joke that lying next to me one day at Arlington would be the closest he ever got to a uniform. I remember smiling at that memory across the table, even with my eyes still swollen from crying in the ambulance. Craig smiled back. It looked genuine. I did not yet know what I was looking at. Day 2. My neighbors Hal and Peggy Dunmore showed up on my porch before I'd even had coffee. Hal is 79, a retired command sergeant major who moved to Meadow Creek with Peggy almost 20 years ago, and he has been Walter's chess partner and my closest friend in this town from nearly the moment I arrived. Hal and Walter played chess every Tuesday evening for the better part of 11 years. On the same worn wooden board Hal had carried with him through 3 different duty stations, and Peggy always joked that between the two of them they'd played the exact same 3 opening moves so many times a person could set a clock by it. When Hal found out I'd served, back before Walter and I were even engaged, he shook my hand like I'd just walked into his unit. And from that day forward, he treated me less like a neighbor's girlfriend and more like a fellow soldier who happened to also make excellent pie. Hal didn't say much that morning. He just stood there in his old field jacket holding a casserole dish Peggy had made. And when I opened the door and saw him, something in me finally cracked, and I cried into his shoulder the way I hadn't let myself cry in front of anyone else yet. Peggy came in behind him and put the casserole in my refrigerator without a word. And then she made a pot of coffee in my own kitchen like she'd done it 100 times. Which, over the years, she basically had. Nora, Hal said, once I'd settled, whatever you need, whenever you need it, you call us first. Not the funeral home. Not Craig. Us. I told him I would. And at the time I thought that was just something people say. I did not yet know how literally I would need to take him up on it. Day 4. That's when it started to shift with Craig and Denise. Denise called me, her voice tight, and told me that she and Craig had already spoken with the funeral director and had finalized most of the arrangements, so I wouldn't have to worry about a thing. I told her I appreciated that, but that I wanted to be involved. That Walter was my husband and I intended to help choose the flowers, the music, the words on the program. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I knew something was wrong before she even spoke again. Nora, she said carefully, Craig thinks it might be better if the service stays focused on family. I asked her what exactly she thought I was. She didn't answer that question. She said she had to go. Day 6. I drove into town to the funeral home myself, because nobody had called me back in 2 days, and I refused to sit at that kitchen table waiting to be informed of my own husband's funeral like a stranger. The director, a kind older man named Mr. Paget who had known Walter for 30 years, looked uncomfortable the moment I walked in. He told me gently that Craig had come in the day before and asked that the guest book and the programs list Walter's immediate family as Craig, Denise, and their children, and that when Mr. Paget had asked about me, Craig had told him I would understand, and that it was complicated. I stood in that lobby, in my church shoes, holding my purse, and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. Not sadness, something else. Something I recognized from 31 years of training. Focus. I called Peggy from the parking lot afterward, sitting in my truck with my hands still shaking a little on the wheel, and I told her what Mr. Paget had said. Peggy went quiet, and then she said something I will never forget. Nora, she said, you fed that man's children Thanksgiving dinner for 19 years. You sat in waiting rooms with him at every single doctor's appointment for the last 5. If Craig Hill thinks he can write you out of the guest book like you were never there, he's about to learn something about you that he clearly never bothered to learn in 19 years. I laughed a little through the lump in my throat. It was the first time I'd laughed since the ambulance. I want to pause here and tell you a little about who I am, because it matters for what comes next. And I promise I won't dwell on the past, because this story isn't really about who I used to be. It's about what I chose to do with 11 days. I enlisted in the United States Army at 19 years old. I served as a combat medic in my early years, and later, after officer candidate school, I spent the back half of my career in logistics and personnel command, retiring as a full colonel. I have stood in rooms with generals. I have signed off on decisions that moved thousands of soldiers and millions of dollars. I have buried friends. I know, better than most people ever will, exactly what it costs to build a life of discipline, patience, and quiet dignity, and exactly what it feels like when someone tries to take that dignity away from you in a single sentence. Craig Hale did not know who he was dealing with. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. I want to tell you about one specific morning early in my career, because I have thought about it constantly these last 11 days. I was 26 years old, a young lieutenant, assigned to a logistics unit responsible for coordinating supply convoys. During a routine review, I discovered a significant discrepancy in a fuel allocation report, one that, if left uncorrected, would have left an entire forward unit critically short during a scheduled operation. I brought it to my commanding officer, a colonel who had built his entire career on never once being questioned by a junior officer, let alone a woman. He told me, in front of 4 other men, that I had clearly misread the figures, and that I should go double-check my math before wasting anyone else's time. I went back to my desk. I did not argue with him in that room. I simply pulled every supporting document, cross-referenced every figure a second time, and returned the next morning with the same conclusion, presented so clearly and so completely that he had no room left to dismiss it. He never apologized. He didn't have to. The convoy schedule was corrected. The shortage never happened. And from that day forward, every report I submitted got read the first time, without question. I learned something in that room that stayed with me for the rest of my career. Something I carried into that funeral home 11 days ago without even realizing I was reaching for it. You do not have to raise your voice to be taken seriously. You simply have to refuse to leave the room until the truth has been heard. Craig Hale was about to learn that lesson the same way that Colonel did, decades later, whether he wanted to or not. Quick note before I keep going, because I know some of you are just joining. If this is the first part of my story you're catching, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and I'll say hello. Now, back to day 7. Day 7, I called our family lawyer, a woman named Patricia Reyes, who had drafted both mine and Walter's paperwork 3 years earlier, back when Walter had a small health scare and we both decided it was time to get our affairs in proper order. I asked her a simple question. I asked her to confirm plainly what Walter's will actually said, because I had a growing, uneasy feeling that his children were operating on assumptions that did not match reality. Patricia went quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said something that made me sit down at the kitchen table all over again. "Nora," she said, "are you sitting down?" I told her I was already there. She said, "I need you to come into the office." Not over the phone, in person. I drove into Bozeman the next morning. Day 8. My hands steady on the wheel the entire way. The way they'd been steady through worse things than this. Patricia's office smelled like fresh coffee and old paper, and she had a folder waiting for me on her desk before I even sat down. She told me that 8 months earlier, Walter had come into her office alone, without telling me, and updated his will. In the updated version, the ranch, the house, the mineral rights, and the majority of his liquid assets were placed into a living trust, with me named as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary for my lifetime, with the remainder passing to Craig, Denise, and their children only after my death. Walter had told Patricia, in a recorded consultation she still had on file, that he was making the change because, and I am going to tell you his exact words, because I will never forget them. My wife has never once asked me for anything in 19 years, and my kids have never once stopped asking. And I think that tells you everything about who actually loves who around here. I sat in that office and I cried for the first time since the ambulance. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to being seen. Patricia let me have my moment, and then she walked me through the legal details, patiently, the way you'd explain something to a soldier who needed to understand a mission before executing it. Under Montana law, she explained, a properly executed living trust supersedes any prior will or informal family expectation. And because Walter had funded the trust himself, transferring title of the ranch and accounts into it while he was alive and unquestionably competent, there was no probate court battle waiting to happen. No ambiguous inheritance to be split according to old assumptions. The land was already, legally, functionally mine. The moment he signed those papers 8 months earlier, Craig and Denise, she told me plainly, had no legal claim whatsoever unless they could somehow prove Walter lacked the mental capacity to make that decision, or that I had coerced him into it, both of which were almost impossible to prove given the recorded consultations sitting in the folder in front of me. Nora, This document is airtight, she said. It was drafted properly, witnessed properly, and recorded properly. But I need to warn you, if Craig finds out about this before the funeral, and if he finds out you already know, things could get ugly very quickly. People do strange things when they think money is about to slip through their fingers. I told her I understood. I did not fully understand yet. Not really. Not until day 9. Day 9, Craig called me in the morning. His voice was different this time, sharper, and he told me without any preamble that he and Denise had decided the funeral would be held at St. Michael's Chapel on Saturday at 11 in the morning, and that afterward there would be a private reception at his house. Family only. I asked him carefully whether I was invited to my own husband's reception. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Nora, I think it would honestly be easier for everybody if you kept a low profile at the service itself. People are going to ask questions about the estate, about the ranch, and I don't think it's fair to put you in an awkward position." I told him I did not understand what he meant by an awkward position. He said plainly, coldly, in a voice I had never heard him use with me before, "Look, we both know Dad's will probably leaves you comfortable. Nobody's disputing that. But this ranch has been in our family for 3 generations. And Denise and I think it makes more sense if we start having a conversation now about what happens to it, before things get complicated with lawyers and paperwork. You understand?" Then he added one more thing, almost as an afterthought, though I now believe it was anything but. He said, "And also, Nora, I've noticed you've seemed a little scattered lately, forgetting things. It's a lot of stress for anyone, especially at your age. I just want you to know, whatever happens, we're looking out for you." I asked him one more question before he could hang up, just to see what he would say. I asked him plainly whether he intended to invite me to my own husband's funeral reception at all, or whether the plan was simply to let me find out about it from someone else afterward. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Look, Nora, don't make this harder than it needs to be." I told him I understood perfectly. I hung up the phone, and then I called Patricia Reyes back and I told her everything Craig had just said, including that last part about being scattered, forgetful, at my age. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and then her voice sharpened in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "Nora," she said, "that sentence right there is not a throwaway comment. That is the first brick in a wall. People don't say things like that by accident when there's 95 million. I'm sorry, when there's a large estate on the line. I want you to start writing down every single conversation you have with him, from this point forward. Dates, times, exact words." I did not fully grasp what she meant until the very next afternoon. Day 9 evening. My phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A woman introducing herself as Miss Anita Patel, a caseworker with the Gallatin County Department of Aging and Adult Services. She told me, in a calm, practiced, careful voice, that her office had received a welfare concern regarding my ability to manage my own affairs and care for myself following my husband's recent death, and that state protocol required her to conduct an in-person assessment. She asked if she could come by the farmhouse the following afternoon. I stood in my kitchen, phone against my ear, and I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, the exact way it had the day the doctors told Walter and me there was nothing more they could do. I told her, of course, come by whenever suits you. I did not ask who had filed the report. I already knew. I called Hal and Peggy that night. Hal was quiet for a long moment after I told him, and then he said, in the flattest, coldest voice I had ever heard from him in 19 years of friendship, "That son of a gun filed a welfare check on you 3 days after his own father's death." Peggy got on the phone next and told me firmly, "Nora, you're the most put-together woman I know. You balance your own books. You still shoot a rifle straighter than half the men at the range. You're going to walk that caseworker through this house, and she is going to see exactly what the rest of us already see." I told her I hoped she was right. I did not sleep well that night. Day 10, the day before the funeral. This is where things turned from painful into something closer to a battle. And I want you to understand that I did not go looking for this fight. I have never once in my life gone looking for a fight. But I have also never once backed away from one that came looking for me. Miss Patel arrived at 1 o'clock. A woman in her 40s with a kind but professional manner, a clipboard, and a county badge clipped to her jacket. She sat with me in the living room and asked me questions plainly, without judgment in her tone, what day of the week it was, who the current president was, how long I had lived in this house, whether I managed my own finances, whether I took any medications, and if so, how I kept track of them. I answered every question clearly, the same way I used to brief senior officers on logistics reports. Precise, unhurried, complete. Then she asked if she could walk through the house, and I told her to please go ahead. We went through the kitchen first, where the refrigerator was stocked and labeled, the pantry organized, nothing left out or forgotten. We went through the bathroom, where my blood pressure medication sat in a labeled weekly organizer, each compartment filled correctly for the days ahead. Finally, we went out to my sewing and record room, a small converted mudroom off the back porch where I kept the ranch's bookkeeping ledgers going back a decade, each one labeled by year, balanced to the penny, alongside a shelf of my own military memorabilia, my old service photographs, a folded flag from a friend's funeral, my dress uniform hanging pressed and ready in a garment bag. Miss Patel looked at the ledgers for a long moment, flipping through the most recent one, and then she looked at me and said, quietly, Mrs. Hale, I've done this job for 11 years. I can tell the difference between someone who needs help and someone who is being targeted. You are not the woman described in that report. She left an hour later, after also speaking briefly by phone with Hal and Peggy, who apparently had a great deal to say on the matter. 2 days after that, I received a formal letter stating the case was closed, no evidence of cognitive decline or self-neglect found, and a note, in careful county language, indicating the referral appeared to have originated from a family dispute rather than a genuine welfare concern, and that any further reports, without substantiated cause, could carry consequences for the reporting party. I sat at my kitchen table holding that letter, and I felt, for the first time in 10 days, something other than grief or fear. I felt vindicated, and underneath that, something else was beginning to take shape, something like resolve. That same afternoon, before Miss Patel had even left, I received the second call. This one came from our bank, Meadow Creek Trust and Savings, from a loan officer named Diane Kowalski, who I had known for years, ever since Walter and I refinanced the barn renovation back in 2019. Diane's voice on the phone was careful, professional, the voice people use when they are about to tell you something they wish they didn't have to. Nora, she said, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll understand why I'm asking. Did you authorize a request yesterday to add Craig Hale as a joint signer on the ranch operating account, along with a request to temporarily freeze your access pending what the paperwork called a review of estate transition? My hands went cold around the phone. I told her, absolutely not. I had never seen that paperwork in my life. Diane exhaled, relieved. I flagged it, she said. The signature on the form didn't match what we have on file for Walter. And since Walter passed, any account changes legally have to go through the estate's executor, not a third party. I rejected the request this morning. But Nora, I think you need to know this was attempted. And I think you need to know who submitted it. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone still in my hand for a long time after that call ended. My husband had been dead for 10 days. His body was not yet in the ground. And in the span of 48 hours, his son had tried to have me declared incompetent and had tried to forge his way into control of the very bank account that paid for the hay, the vet bills, and the property taxes on land Walter's own father had cleared with a mule team 70 years earlier. I want to tell you that I felt rage in that moment, because it would make for a better story, a cleaner story. But the truth is, what I actually felt was something quieter and colder. I felt the exact same feeling I used to get in the army the moment a mission stopped being theoretical and became real. A kind of stillness, a kind of clarity. I picked up the phone and I called Patricia Reyes. And then I called the Meadow Creek County Sheriff's Department, and I filed a report. The deputy who took my statement, a young man named Officer Reyes, no relation to Patricia. Small towns are funny that way. Wrote everything down carefully, photographed the paperwork Diane had emailed over, and told me plainly that attempting to forge a signature to gain unauthorized access to a deceased person's assets is a felony in the state of Montana. He gave me a case number. I put it in the same drawer where I kept Walter's father's dog tags from his Korean War service, The drawer where I kept the things that mattered. The things worth protecting. The things that told the truth even when the people around you were doing everything they could to bury it. Hal drove me to the sheriff's office himself, even though I told him I could manage it alone, because he said plainly that some things a person shouldn't have to walk into by themselves, even a colonel. He sat in the waiting room the entire time, reading a 2-year-old fishing magazine, and when I came out he simply stood, put a hand briefly on my shoulder, and said, "Let's get you home, Nora, that's all." It was exactly enough. That evening, day 10, Denise called me. Her voice was different from Craig's softer, more uncertain, the voice of someone who has spent her whole life standing slightly behind a louder sibling. "Nora," she said, "I heard you're planning to come to the service tomorrow." I told her, of course I was coming. I was Walter's wife. There was a long silence. Then she said, very quietly, almost like she didn't want to say it out loud, "Craig doesn't think that's a good idea." I asked her what she thought. Another silence. Longer this time. "I don't know, Nora," she finally said. "I really don't know anymore." I did not sleep much that night. I lay in the bed Walter and I had shared for 19 years. On my side, looking at the empty space where his side used to be. And I thought about 31 years of service, about every room I had ever walked into where someone doubted whether I belonged there. About every single time in my career I had been underestimated by a man who assumed a woman my size, my age, my quiet manner, couldn't possibly be the one actually running the operation. I remembered a briefing early in my career, my first year as a young officer, when a colonel twice my age looked past me at a junior sergeant standing beside me and asked him to confirm the numbers I had just personally verified. I did not raise my voice that day. I simply repeated the numbers myself, slower, clearer, and let the silence that followed do the correcting for me. I thought about Walter's exact words to Patricia Reyes. "Recorded on file, my wife has never once asked me for anything, and my kids have never once stopped asking." And somewhere around 3 in the morning, lying in that dark bedroom, I made a decision. I was not simply going to attend my husband's funeral tomorrow. I was going to arrive the way I had arrived at every important moment of my career. In full uniform, standing tall, impossible to ignore, and impossible to remove. Day 11, funeral day. I woke before dawn, the way I had woken every single day of my military career. And I did not rush. I ironed my dress uniform myself, the same way I had ironed it 100 times before important ceremonies. Careful, precise creases, every button polished. I pinned my ribbons in the exact correct order, the order I had memorized so long ago it lived in my hands now more than my mind. My Bronze Star, my Meritorious Service Medal, my Army Commendation Medals, my service ribbons from 3 different decades of duty. I pinned my nameplate. I put on my beret. Before I left the bedroom, I stood for a moment in front of the closet where Walter's flannel shirt still hung beside my formal blues, and I reached out and touched the sleeve of his favorite one, the faded red plaid he wore nearly every winter morning for as long as I'd known him, and I said, out loud, to an empty room, "Wish me luck, old man." Then I looked at myself in the mirror, 73 years old, alone for the first time in 19 years. And I did not see a widow being pushed out of a room. I saw Colonel Eleanor Hale, United States Army, retired, and I saw a woman who had never once in her life allowed anyone to tell her she didn't belong somewhere she had every right to be. I drove into town alone. I want you to sit with that for a second. A 73-year-old widow, 11 days after burying her husband in her heart, if not yet in the ground, driving herself to his funeral because his own children hadn't bothered to ask if she needed a ride. I parked outside St. Michael's Chapel at 10:45, 15 minutes before the service, and I sat in my truck for 1 minute, just breathing, the way I used to breathe before walking into a briefing room full of men who doubted me. Then I got out, and I walked toward the doors. Craig was standing outside, greeting people, shaking hands, playing the role of grieving eldest son with an ease that turned my stomach a little, considering what I already knew he'd tried to do to that bank account, and to my standing with the county. 2 days earlier, he saw me coming across the parking lot, and I watched his whole posture change. He walked quickly toward me, cutting off my path to the doors, and he lowered his voice so the arriving guests wouldn't hear. "Nora," he said, "What is this?" I told him plainly that I was attending my husband's funeral, dressed the way I chose to dress. He said, "This isn't the time for it," and here he actually gestured at my uniform, at my medals, at 19 years of marriage and 31 years of service standing right in front of him for a performance. I told him I was not performing anything. I told him this uniform represented 31 years of my life, the same way that wrench represented 70 years of his family's life, and that I had every right to wear it to say goodbye to the men I loved. Craig's jaw tightened. He said, low and fast, "Look, I don't want a scene. Nora, if you cause a scene today, in front of everyone, it's not going to look good for you when it comes time to talk about the estate, or about your competency, if it comes to that." I looked at him for a long moment, and I felt that last threat land exactly the way he wanted it to, cold, deliberate, meant to frighten a woman he assumed had nothing behind her but grief. He had no idea what I already had behind me. And then I asked him the one question I had been holding onto since day 9. The question I mentioned to you at the very beginning of this story. I asked him, "Craig, did you enjoy filling out the paperwork at Meadow Creek Trust and Savings 2 days ago? Because the bank has a copy of it. And so does the Sheriff's Department. And while we're at it, so does Gallatin County Adult Services, who closed their case on me yesterday and left a note in the file about the true origin of that report." His face went the color of a bedsheet. I did not wait for him to respond. I walked past him, through the doors of Steady Michael's chapel, and I made my way down the center aisle in my full dress uniform, my medals catching the light from the stained glass windows, and I sat down in the front pew, the pew that belonged to me as Walter's wife. The pew Craig and Denise had apparently hoped I would never claim. I heard the whispers start behind me almost immediately. I did not turn around. I had spent 31 years learning how to walk into a room and hold my ground without needing to look over my shoulder to know people were watching. The chapel smelled the way small country chapels always do. Old wood and candle wax and fresh-cut lilies from the arrangements near the casket, and morning light came through the stained glass and long-colored strips across the pews. I sat with my back straight, the way 31 years of formation had trained into my spine so thoroughly. I couldn't have slouched if I tried, and I set my beret on my knee and folded my hands over it. Denise came in a few minutes later, and when she saw me sitting in the front pew in my uniform, she stopped in the aisle, and for just a moment, I watched something shift in her face, not shock exactly, more like recognition, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in 19 years. She walked over and sat down beside me without a word. Craig came in last, visibly rattled, and took his seat on the other side of the aisle with his own wife and children, as far from me as the small chapel would physically allow. His eldest daughter, a girl of 16 I had watched grow up from a toddler who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long summer barbecues, caught my eye briefly across the aisle and gave me a small, uncertain wave. The kind of gesture that told me the children in that family understood far more about what was happening than their parents probably realized. I smiled at her and nodded, and she seemed to relax just slightly in her seat. Hal and Peggy came in a few minutes after that and slid quietly into the pew directly behind mine. Hal in a jacket and tie I had never once seen him wear, Peggy squeezing my shoulder once before sitting down. The service began. Pastor Elliott, who had known Walter for over 20 years, spoke beautifully about a man who built things with his hands and loved fiercely and quietly. A man who once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring hay to a neighbor's starving cattle, without ever telling anyone he'd done it. I sat in that front pew in my uniform and I cried. Real tears, not performance. Exactly what Craig had accused me of when he had absolutely no idea what real grief actually looks like on a person who has buried friends in far worse circumstances than a quiet chapel on a Saturday morning. And then, near the end of the service, Pastor Elliott invited family members to share a few words if they wished. Craig stood first and gave a short, careful eulogy about his father's work ethic, his stubbornness, his love of the land, a eulogy that, I noticed, did not once mention my name. 19 years of marriage completely erased in 3 minutes of polished sentences. He sat back down, satisfied with himself, avoiding my eyes. I stood next. I walked to the front of that chapel in my dress uniform, and I looked out at the room Walter's old ranching friends, our small church community, Craig's children who I had watched grow up, Denise sitting in the front pew with tears already running down her face, Hal and Peggy just behind her, and I told them the truth. I told them about the man who taught me to ride a horse again at 62 years old because he said a woman who'd survived 31 years of army service had no business being scared of a horse. I told them about the morning 11 days earlier, holding his hand in the ambulance, doing everything in my power and training to save him, and how none of that training had prepared me for the silence afterward. And then I told them one more thing, because I decided, standing right there in front of everyone, that I was done being quiet for the sake of other people's comfort. I told them that in the last 3 days alone, someone had attempted to forge my husband's signature to gain unauthorized control of our bank accounts, and had also filed a false welfare report attempting to have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs, only 10 days after my husband's death. I did not accuse anyone by name. I did not have to. I watched Craig's face in the third pew, and I watched half the room turn to look at him without meaning to. The way people do when a sentence lands, somewhere specific even, without a name attached to it. I finished by saying that Walter Hale spent his whole life building something with his own two hands, brick by brick, fence post by fence post, and that I intended to spend whatever years I had left making sure nobody tore it down out of greed. Then I sat back down. The rest of the service passed in a strange, charged silence. Afterward, at the small gathering outside the chapel, several of Walter's old ranching friends came up to me, one by one, and told me quietly that they'd always known I was the one who truly loved him. One older rancher named Hank Dorsey, a man Walter had known since childhood, gripped my hand and said, "Nora, whatever's going on with those kids, you let us know if you need anything. That family's land has been the Hale land for 3 generations. It ought to stay in the hands of whoever actually loved it." I thanked him, and I meant it more than he probably realized. Craig approached me in the parking lot afterward, his composure cracked, real anger showing through now that the performance for the guests was over. He said, "You humiliated me in there." I told him calmly that I had not said his name once. I told him that if he felt humiliated, it was because he recognized his own actions in what I said, and that was not something I could take responsibility for. He said, "We'll see what a judge thinks about all this." I told him he was welcome to find out. Craig's private reception at his house that afternoon, I later learned, was thin, quiet, and short. Most of Walter's old friends chose instead to follow Hal and Peggy back to their place where Peggy had quietly started cooking that morning before the service even began, as if she'd known exactly how the day would go. 12 of us ended up crowded into their small living room that evening, plates on our laps, telling old stories about Walter, the time he tried to teach himself to weld and set his own sleeve on fire, the time he drove 4 hours through a snowstorm for a neighbor and never told a soul until Pastor Elliot mentioned it that morning, the time he proposed to me on the back porch with a ring he'd hidden inside an old coffee can in the barn for 3 weeks because he was terrified I'd find it early. We laughed. We cried. Nobody asked me a single question about the estate, the ranch, or the trust. For the first time in 11 days, I simply got to be a widow surrounded by people who loved her husband, instead of a woman defending her right to exist in a room. Hal raised a glass near the end of the night and said, "To Walter Hale, a man who built one hell of a foundation, and one hell of a wife to go with it." Everyone clinked glasses. I cried again. But it was the good kind, the kind that comes from finally being seen. 3 days after the funeral, Craig came out to the farmhouse alone in the evening, carrying a bouquet of grocery store flowers still wrapped in cellophane. I was on the back porch when his truck pulled in, and for one brief moment, some old habit of hope in me wondered if he had actually come to apologize. He walked up the steps and set the flowers on the porch railing without meeting my eyes at first. "Nora," he said, "I think we got off on the wrong foot with all of this." I didn't say anything. I just watched him. He pulled out the other porch chair and sat down, his hands clasped between his knees, and he said, "Look, I've been thinking, this whole legal fight, it's going to cost both of us. Lawyers, stress, all of it dragged out for months, maybe years. What if we just settled it between us? family to family. I asked him what exactly he had in mind. He said, "You keep the house, obviously. Nobody's asking you to leave your home. But the ranch itself, the land, that's been in the Hale name for 3 generations. What if we split it? You keep the house and 10 acres around it for as long as you live. And Denise and I take over the working land and the cattle operation. We'll even set you up with a monthly allowance. $5,000 a month, more than fair. And you never have to worry about a legal battle again. We could be a family again. Nora, Sunday dinners, the whole thing, just like it used to be before all this." I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered him. I told him that what he was describing was not a family reconciling. It was a man who had tried to forge a bank document and file a false welfare report against his own stepmother, now offering her a monthly stipend in exchange for walking away from land that was already legally and rightfully hers. Craig's expression shifted, the warmth draining out of it fast, the way it always seemed to the moment he didn't get exactly what he wanted. He said, "You'd rather fight this out in a courtroom than take a generous deal?" I told him it wasn't about generosity. It was about the fact that he had spent the last 2 weeks trying to have me declared incompetent and robbed. And now, when that hadn't worked, he was trying to buy his way to the same result with a smaller number and a friendlier smile. He stood up fast, the porch chair scraping against the wood. "You're going to regret this," he said. "You're 73 years old. Nora, how many good years do you really have left to spend fighting us in court?" I looked up at him. Calm. Steady. The same way I used to look at officers twice my rank who thought volume could substitute for being right. I told him, "However many years I have left, I intend to spend every single one of them in a house that is mine, on land that is mine, having earned both the honest way," which is more than he could say for himself. He left without the flowers. I found them wilted on the porch railing 3 days later and finally threw them away. The weeks that followed were not simple, and I won't pretend they were. Craig hired a lawyer and formally contested the trust, claiming Walter had been of diminished mental capacity when he updated it 8 months earlier, a claim that fell apart within the first meeting once Patricia Reyes produced a recorded consultation, where Walter spoke clearly, articulately, and at length about exactly why he was making the change. Craig's lawyer, a sharp young attorney out of Bozeman, quietly withdrew from the case after learning about the attempted bank forgery, the false welfare report, and the open sheriff's department investigation, telling the mediator he could not in good conscience continue representing a client under active criminal investigation for financial fraud related to the very estate in dispute. I want to tell you about the day of the mediation, because it was, in its own way, the true ending of this story, more than the funeral itself. We met at a conference room in Bozeman, Patricia Reyes beside me, a neutral mediator named Mr. Griggs at the head of the table, Craig and his new, visibly uncomfortable lawyer on the other side. Denise came too, but she sat slightly apart from her brother, not quite on either side of the room. Craig's lawyer opened first, a young attorney named Preston Marsh, who had clearly been hired in a hurry after the original counsel withdrew. He argued that a lifetime of family labor and expectations should carry legal weight, that Craig and Denise had grown up assuming they would inherit the ranch someday, and that Walter's decision, made privately and without consulting his children, represented an unfair and possibly unduly influenced departure from decades of implied promise. It was a reasonable-sounding argument, delivered smoothly, and for one uncomfortable moment I watched Mr. Griggs actually nod along with parts of it. Then Patricia stood. She did not raise her voice. She simply opened her folder and, one document at a time, dismantled the entire argument. "This," she said, placing the first page on the table, "is a recorded legal consultation from 8 months before Mr. Hale's passing, in which he speaks clearly, at length, and entirely coherently about his reasons for the change. This," she continued, placing a second document down, "is a written statement from Meadow Creek Trust and Savings confirming an attempted forged signature submitted in Craig Hale's name 3 days after his father's death. This, a third page, is a Gallatin County case file, confirming a welfare report filed against my client was investigated and closed as unsubstantiated, with a formal note questioning the motive behind the referral. And this, A fourth page is an open Sheriff's Department investigation into felony forgery. Case number attached, Mr. Griggs, she said, closing the folder. My client did not receive a gift from her husband. She received the ranch because for 19 years, she was the one who actually showed up. Everyone else in this room can decide for themselves what that says about implied promises. Craig's case did not simply weaken after that. It collapsed entirely within the first 40 minutes. At one point, the mediator turned to Denise and asked if she had anything she wanted to say. Denise was quiet for a long moment, twisting a tissue in her hands. And then she said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "I want to withdraw my name from the contest." Craig's head snapped toward her. She kept going, her voice shaking but steady underneath the shake. Nora took care of Dad for 19 years. She learned to ride a horse for him. She sat with him at every single doctor's appointment for the last 5 years while Craig and I visited twice a year if we were lucky. I've been so angry about feeling left out of Dad's life that I let myself believe Nora was the reason, when the truth is, we did that to ourselves. I'm done pretending otherwise. Craig stormed out of that mediation room, and as far as I know, he has not spoken to his sister since, which is its own kind of quiet tragedy, one I did not cause and could not have prevented, no matter how much I wish things were different for Denise's sake. The mediator's final recommendation, issued 2 weeks later, upheld the trust exactly as written. The ranch, the house, the mineral rights, and the majority of Walter's estate remained mine, with the provision that upon my death, everything would pass to Denise and her children, with Craig explicitly excluded per an amendment Walter had made himself. In his own recorded words, after learning through Patricia what his son had attempted regarding the bank account months earlier in a smaller, unrelated disputed detail I did not even know until the mediation itself, which told me that somewhere, in whatever place people go, Walter had found out exactly what his son was capable of long before I ever did, and he had made his final decision accordingly, quietly, without ever burdening me with it, while he was still alive to protect me from it himself. The criminal case against Craig, covering both the attempted forgery and the false welfare report, is still moving through the county court system as I record this. His lawyer is trying to negotiate the charges down, but the district attorney's office has made clear they intend to pursue it seriously. Given the clear evidence and the vulnerability of the intended victim, I do not know how it will end. I have made my peace with not needing to control that outcome. I got my justice in the room that mattered most to me, in front of the people who actually knew and loved my husband. On the day we said goodbye to him, 3 weeks after the mediation, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address, just my name written in careful, familiar handwriting. I opened it standing right there by the mailbox, my hands trembling a little, because I already knew before I even unfolded the pages. It was from Denise. 2 full pages, front and back, the ink smudged in places like she'd been crying while she wrote it. I am not going to read you every word of that letter, because some things belong only to the two of us, but I will tell you what mattered most. She wrote that for years, Craig had told her I resented having them gone from our lives, that I only tolerated them out of politeness, that I talked about them unkindly to the neighbors, none of which was true. Not one word of it. But she had believed him, because it was easier than facing her own guilt about how little she had shown up for her own father while he was alive. She wrote that she understood if I never wanted to see her again. She wrote that she loved me, and that she was sorry, and that those two things had to exist in the same letter because both of them were true at once. I did not respond right away. I sat with that letter for 3 days, out on the back porch most evenings, reading it again each time the light started to fade. On the 4th day, there was a knock at my door, and it was Denise, standing on the porch in jeans and an old sweater, her eyes already red before I even opened the door. "Hi, Nora," she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I invited her in. We sat in the living room, in the same chairs Walter and I used to sit in every evening, and for a long moment neither of us said a word. Then I told her what I am about to tell you now, because I think it matters for anyone listening who is standing at the edge of a broken relationship, wondering whether it's worth trying to repair. I told her, "I forgive you. I do. But forgiveness does not mean pretending the last several months never happened. It means we get to start over slowly, honestly, as two people who genuinely love each other and are willing to earn each other's trust back one Sunday dinner at a time. Denise cried, and I held her, the way I used to hold her when she was small enough to sit on my lap while Walter and I sketched out plans for the barn addition on graph paper at this very table. We started with Sunday dinners, the way Walter and I used to do every week before things fell apart. The first one was quiet and a little stiff, both of us being careful with our words. By the fourth one, her youngest boy, a 9-year-old named Walter after his grandfather, was asking me if I would teach him to ride a horse, the same way his grandfather had once taught me. I told him yes before he'd even finished asking. The first lesson, we didn't even get on the horse. I made him spend a full 20 minutes just standing near old Duchess, our gentlest mare, letting her get used to his smell, his voice, the sound of his footsteps, the same patient groundwork Walter had once made me do at 62 years old when I was far too proud to admit how frightened I actually was. Young Walter grumbled about it a little, the way 9-year-olds do about anything that isn't immediately exciting. But by the third lesson he was walking Duchess around the corral on his own, grinning so wide I had to look away for a second so he wouldn't see me tearing up over something as simple as a boy and a horse. Denise stood at the fence rail those afternoons, arms crossed over the top board, watching. And one Sunday she said quietly, without looking at me, "Thank you for not giving up on us." I told her the same thing I'd told her the day she showed up on my porch with that letter. "I never gave up on you. I just needed you to come find your own way back." 6 weeks after the funeral, I did something I had been thinking about since that morning in Patricia Reyes's office, and again during that long, humiliating afternoon with Miss Patel's clipboard in my own living room. I used a portion of the estate to establish a small foundation, the Walter and Eleanor Hale Family Land Trust, dedicated to helping elderly widows and widowers in rural Montana access legal support when family members attempt to exploit them financially or emotionally after the loss of a spouse. Patricia Reyes agreed to serve as legal director. Miss Patel, once her county position allowed for it, began consulting with us part-time on how to help families recognize the early warning signs of exactly what happened to me. In the 4 months since we opened, we have helped 11 families, 11 people who called us frightened and confused, the exact way I felt sitting at my kitchen table with that phone in my hand on day 10. And I intend to keep that number growing for as long as I am able. I think often about our third case, a woman named Ruth, 81 years old, living alone outside Livingston after her husband of 52 years passed away suddenly. Her grandson had convinced her, gently and patiently over the course of a single grieving week, to sign paperwork he described as just something to make things easier while you're overwhelmed. It was, in fact, a limited power of attorney over her checking account. By the time Ruth called our office, frightened and unsure whether she had done something wrong, over $11,000 had already been withdrawn. Patricia had the authorization frozen and reversed within a week, and the grandson, once confronted with the paper trail, returned every dollar rather than face the same kind of investigation Craig was facing. Ruth cried on the phone with me afterward, and she said something that has stayed with me since. She said, "I didn't think anyone would believe an old woman over her own grandson." I told her exactly what I am telling you now. Somebody will always believe you, as long as you are willing to speak up loud enough and keep enough proof in your pocket to make yourself impossible to dismiss. I still get up before dawn most mornings, the way I have my entire adult life. And I walk the fence line the way Walter used to, checking the water trough where I found him that Tuesday morning, a spot I have made my peace with instead of avoiding. Hal still comes by twice a week for chess, and he still loses more often than he'd like to admit. Peggy still shows up with a casserole anytime she senses my week has been harder than usual, which this year has been more often than either of us would like. Some evenings the three of us just sit on my back porch in silence, watching the sun drop behind the mountains, and nobody feels the need to fill the quiet with words. After 31 years of service and 19 years of marriage, I have come to believe that kind of comfortable silence, shared with people who never once tried to push you out of a room, is its own quiet form of love. I still wear my dress uniform sometimes, not for any particular occasion, Just some mornings when the house feels too quiet and I need to remember exactly who I am. I keep it hanging in the closet on Walter's side of the bedroom now, next to a few of his old flannel shirts I never could bring myself to give away. Some mornings I stand in front of that closet and I think about the day Craig told me I wasn't real family, standing in the doorway of a funeral home, trying to make himself feel bigger by making me feel smaller. I think about how wrong he was, and how much he underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. And I think, honestly, that Walter would have found the whole thing darkly funny, in the way he found most difficult things funny, right up until the moment he wasn't there to laugh about it with me anymore. A few weeks after the mediation concluded, once the dust had finally settled enough for me to breathe, without bracing for the next phone call, I drove out to the county cemetery alone one Sunday afternoon to visit Walter's grave for the first time without a lawyer's folder or a case number weighing down my purse. The headstone was simple, exactly the way he'd asked for it to be, granite gray with his name and the dates and one line underneath that I'd chosen myself. He built things that lasted. I sat down on the grass beside it, in my regular clothes this time. No uniform, no audience, just me in the quiet. And I told him everything. I told him about the trust, about Craig, about the bank and the county and the mediation room in Bozeman. I told him about wearing his own words back at his son like a shield, the way he'd apparently known, somewhere deep down, that I might one day need to. I told him about Denise's letter, about the lilacs we hadn't planted yet, about how losing at chess to an empty chair every Tuesday now out of pure stubborn habit. And then I sat there for a long while longer, not saying anything at all, just letting the wind move through the pines the way it always did on that hillside. And for the first time since the ambulance ride, I felt something close to peace settle over me instead of just grief with its teeth bared. This past spring, almost a full year after the funeral, Denise came out to help me plant a row of new lilac bushes along the driveway, the same spot where Walter had always talked about putting in a proper garden and never quite got around to it. We worked side by side most of the morning, dirt under our fingernails, her boy running around the yard chasing our old ranch dog. When we finished, she looked at the freshly turned earth and said, "When will they bloom?" I told her, "Late spring probably, maybe May." She smiled and said, "Mom would have loved this." It was the first time in over a year she had ever called me that, without a single moment of hesitation, and I had to turn away for a second so she wouldn't see my face. People sometimes ask me if I regret how things ended with Craig, whether I wish I had handled things more quietly, more privately, the way families are supposed to handle their business behind closed doors. I tell them the truth. I spent 31 years of my life being told, in small ways and large ones, that a woman my size, my age, my quiet manner, needed to make herself smaller, in rooms full of people who assumed they knew better than she did. I am 73 years old. I buried a husband I loved for 19 years. I am done making myself smaller for anyone's comfort but my own. If you are watching this and you are going through something similar, if you have a family member trying to convince you that your grief doesn't count, that your love doesn't count, that your years of quiet devotion somehow entitle you to less than the people who showed up twice a year, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not have to disappear to keep the peace. You are allowed to stand in the front pew. You are allowed to wear your medals. You are allowed to ask the one question that makes the person hurting you finally understand that you were never as small as they assumed. If there is one practical thing I want you to take from my story tonight, beyond the emotion of it, it is this: get your paperwork in order before you need it, not after. Know exactly where your important documents live, and know exactly who has access to them. If a family member ever begins a sentence with some version of "we just think it would be easier if," treat that as the beginning of a negotiation, not a kindness, and involve a lawyer before you involve your trust. Write things down the moment they happen, dates and exact words, because memory fades under stress exactly when you need it most. And never, ever let anyone convince you that your age is a weakness to be managed rather than a lifetime of experience to be respected. I built 31 years of discipline long before Craig Hale ever tried to test it, and it held exactly the way Walter always said a good foundation should. Walter used to tell me that the strongest structures aren't the ones that never get tested. They're the ones that get tested hard, again and again, and hold anyway. I think about that every single day I walk this land that is legally, rightfully, and finally, undeniably mine. I did not fight for the money. Lord knows, at my age, with my pension and 31 years of careful savings, I did not need it. I fought because letting Craig push me out of that funeral home, out of that chapel, out of 19 years of my own life, would have meant admitting that none of it had ever mattered. And I refuse. Even now, even 73 years old and still grieving some mornings more than others, to admit that 19 years of loving a good man never mattered. I am Colonel Eleanor Hale, United States Army, retired. This is my story, and I stood in it exactly the way I was trained to, standing tall, holding the line, and never once backing out of a room I had every right to be in. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. And tell me again where you're watching from, I promise you. I read every single one. Take care of each other out there, and take care of the people who show up for you quietly, year after year, without ever once being asked to. Those are the ones worth fighting for. And if there's an old flannel shirt hanging in your closet too, one that belonged to somebody who used to believe in you louder than you believed in yourself, go touch the sleeve tonight and say thank you. I promise you, wherever they are, they hear it. Good night, everyone. This is Colonel Eleanor Hale, signing off from Meadow Creek, Montana, still standing, still holding the line.